3 weeks ago, an executive order landed on desks in Washington that was meant to bring Canada to its knees. Today, it is the image of a single man standing before an emergency session of Parliament that will haunt the White House for the rest of this administration. Mark Carney stood before a joint session, flanked by diplomats from 23 nations watching in absolute silence, and delivered the 7 words that have officially inverted a continental alliance and sent shockwaves through every capital from Tokyo to Berlin. You didn't remove us, you removed yourself. This is not routine political theatre. It is a pivotal moment where the architecture of North American power has fundamentally cracked. What began as a Tuesday afternoon executive order, 4 pages of blunt language, executed with zero consultation with Congress, no warning to industry, and a complete disregard for the 60-day negotiation period required under the framework's own Article 22, has in just 21 days become the single most consequential self-inflicted economic wound in modern American history. Here is the timeline to keep the ings clear, because understanding the sequencing reveals how a calculation of maximum leverage transformed into a strategic catastrophe. On day 1, the White House accused Canada of failing to demonstrate adequate commitment to American economic priorities, claiming Canadian leaders exploited the agreement to undermine US trade interests. The administration then issued a 72-hour ultimatum to vacate every joint coordination office, terminate every shared regulatory process, and sever every integrated customs system that had seamlessly processed more than $2 billion in cross-border trade every single day for over 3 decades. By week 1, as Washington expected a frantic return to the negotiating table, the script flipped. Canada did not sue for peace. Instead, Ottawa utilised its sudden legal freedom to dismantle the exclusivity provisions that had locked its wealth into American markets. By week 2, global capital responded, and by week 3, the United States found itself completely locked out of the very supply chains it had spent 31 years dominating. This is not a coincidence. This is a highly sequenced, deliberate political and diplomatic counter-operation. That is the official fallout, but here is the other half of the story that most surface-level coverage has entirely missed. This framework was never a simple trade deal. It was the foundational operating system of the continental economy, built incrementally across 6 administrations of both political parties. It governed how energy flows across the longest undefended border in the world, how intelligence is shared to foil transnational threats, and how critical minerals move from Canadian mines to American defense platforms. It functioned so smoothly that Washington forgot it was even there, treating a deeply symbiotic partnership as unilateral leverage. In the span of a single executive order, that operating system was erased, prompting international law scholars from Oxford to the Sorbonne to immediately condemn the termination as a violation of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. 31 nations issued formal statements of concern, not out of sentimental solidarity with Ottawa, but because every country holding a bilateral agreement with the United States had to face a terrifying realization. If Washington can tear up a 3-decade partnership with its closest ally in 72 hours, no American agreement is worth the paper it is written on. To truly understand what this means for Canadian sovereignty, look at the energy sector, where the numbers ground the abstract shift into cold reality. Under the terminated framework, Canada supplied 61% of all crude oil imported by the United States. That is not a niche supplier relationship. It is the literal backbone of American energy security. Furthermore, Canada provided 38% of natural gas imports to northern states and 97% of electricity imports for border communities stretching from Maine to Washington state. The framework's grid synchronization protocols, which took more than a decade to negotiate, allowed power to flow seamlessly across the border to prevent cascading failures during extreme weather events. The executive order terminated that synchronization instantly. Within 48 hours, grid operators in New England and the upper Midwest activated emergency protocols never used outside simulation exercises, facing a winter forecast to be the coldest in 15 years with 11% less grid capacity. Natural gas prices in the upper Midwest surged 43% within 10 days as pipeline agreements reverted to volatile spot market pricing. The framework was never a Canadian benefit. It was an American lifeline, and Washington cut it themselves. The story moves rapidly from an energy crisis to a national security emergency when you look at critical minerals. Canada represents the primary or sole North American source of nickel, cobalt, potash, uranium, lithium, and 17 of the 23 rare earth elements that the Pentagon classifies as essential to national defense. Inside the framework, American defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon possessed guaranteed priority access at stable, pre-negotiated prices consistently below global market rates. That was not Canadian charity. It was a strategic arrangement where Canada traded lower prices for guaranteed continental market share. Without the framework, those minerals are now subjected to open market dynamics, where China controls 67% of global rare earth processing. An internal Department of Defense memo, verified by independent sources, warned that the termination created immediate vulnerabilities in 7 active weapons procurement programs, including the F-35 fighter jet and the Columbia-class submarine. The Pentagon's immediate response was a recommendation to ask Canada to voluntarily restore access, at Canada's discretion and Canada's price. The calculation backfired completely. Washington kicked Ottawa out on Monday, and by Friday they were begging for access to the vault, only to find the combination had changed. The immediate economic pain, however, hit the automotive manufacturing sector the fastest and hardest. The manufacturing base of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Tennessee operates on an integration so deep that a single vehicle crosses the US-Canada border an average of 7 times during its production cycle. Engines from Ontario feed assembly lines in Michigan. Transmissions from Indiana rely on Canadian aluminum. Wiring harnesses are assembled in Quebec. The framework's regulatory harmonisation meant these crossings occurred with zero friction, matching safety standards, emission certifications, and customs processing. The executive order shattered this integration overnight, forcing every single crossing to require independent inspection and separate certification. The Auto Alliance estimated this new friction adds $11,000 in structural costs per vehicle, driving up consumer prices by an average of $900 within 6 months. Already, 3 major assembly plants in Michigan and Ohio have announced temporary shutdowns, idling more than 15,000 workers. General Motors estimated a per-vehicle cost increase of $12,000 if the framework is not restored within 90 days, a figure that effectively prices American-made vehicles out of global markets. The United Auto Workers stated bluntly that their members are not facing standard layoffs, but are instead casualties of an economic policy no one asked for and no domestic industry can survive. Suscuse to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis as we unmask these global power shifts. And make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button to keep track of this fast-moving story. What the White House failed to realise is that inside the old framework, Canada was legally and structurally constrained. Exclusivity provisions explicitly prevented Ottawa from signing preferential trade agreements with non-members, while regulatory harmonisation locked Canadian manufacturers to American specifications, making it incredibly costly to pivot to European or Asian markets. Energy integration committed Canadian supply to American demand at depressed rates. The framework was a ceiling that protected American access while limiting Canada's global reach. Donald Trump tore up the ceiling, and the moment the executive order took effect, every constraint vanished. Canadian oil, critical minerals, and manufacturing capacity became available to the highest global bidder, and those bidders were waiting with pen in hand. Within 1 single week, Canada signed provisional trade memoranda with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. The EU agreement alone opens European markets to Canadian energy at prices 22% above previous American rates. While Japan's Ministry of Economy immediately announced a $2.3 billion investment in Canadian rare earth processing facilities, the exact type of investment framework exclusivity had previously blocked. The cage was opened, and the bird flew straight to markets that valued it more. This is the strategic reality that Warren Buffett captured in an interview that has now accumulated over 50 million views. He noted that while most strategic or operational mistakes can be recovered, firing a partner who was doing more for you than you were doing for them is entirely permanent. The moment that partner is set free, they discover their true value on the open market is vastly higher, while you discover that your entire prosperity was built on a beneficiary illusion. The old agreement was indeed lopsided, but it was lopsided entirely in America's favour. Canada provided energy, minerals, and highly integrated labour below alternative global costs, while Washington believed it was doing Ottawa a favour. Now, 14 governors and 37 senators are demanding emergency framework restoration to stop the bleeding, while the Business Roundtable and the US Chamber of Commerce have called the termination an act of unprecedented economic self-sabotage. Public opinion has shifted with remarkable speed, with 64% of Americans now opposing the expulsion. The leverage has permanently dissolved, dispersed across a dozen new global partnerships that completely exclude the United States. Ottawa has realised its worth, the continental operating system is dead, and the global chessboard has been permanently reordered. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. That unanswered question goes to the very heart of the global financial system. How do you value an economic anchor once it has been cast adrift? To answer that, we have to look past the political rhetoric and dive directly into the hidden architecture of the emergency agreements Ottawa signed in the 72 hours following the expulsion, while Washington was anticipating an immediate Canadian economic collapse. A small circle of officials within the Privy Council office and the Department of Finance executed a pre-drafted contingency plan that effectively weaponized Canada's structural assets. This was not a panicked response, it was a cold, calculated pivot toward a multipolar trade architecture designed to permanently replace the single buyer vulnerability that had defined Canadian commerce for a century. The crown jewel of this new architecture is the Comprehensive Pacific Atlantic Security and Resource Treaty, a multilateral framework rapidly assembled by Canada, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea. To understand how deeply this shifts global wealth, we have to break down the specific components, the key players, and the financial terms of this newly engineered operating system across three distinct structural pillars. First, the establishment of the Sovereign Resource Allocation Mechanism. Under the old rules with Washington, Canadian resources were structurally captive due to pipeline geography and harmonised regulatory barriers. The new treaty replaces this single buyer model with an automated, multi-tiered bidding system for Canada's uncommitted energy and mineral outputs. The key players here are the state-backed infrastructure funds of Japan and South Korea, working alongside European energy conglomerates. The financial terms are explicitly designed to penalise the United States while rewarding diversified buyers. The agreement guarantees that European and Asian buyers receive a permanent 15% discount below global spot pricing for the next 15 years, provided they fund the immediate maritime infrastructure retrofits at Canadian ports. For example, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry has committed $3.1 billion Canadian dollars to fast-track the expansion of the Ridley Island Export Terminal in Prince Rupert, British Columbia. This structural shift moves 450,000 barrels of crude oil per day, previously destined for refineries in the American Midwest, directly into the Trans-Pacific shipping lanes, completely bypassing the Mid-Continent pipeline network. Second, the creation of the Euro-Pacific Critical Minerals Consortium. This is the structural counterpunch to the Pentagon's supply chain crisis. Under this pillar, Canada has legally bound its state-owned and federally regulated mining assets into a joint venture with European defence primes and Asian electronics manufacturers. The architectural design of this mechanism is precise. It creates an absolute exclusivity zone for the extraction and processing of the 17 rare earth elements mined in Northern Ontario and the Northwest Territories. The financial terms dictate a $45 billion Canadian dollar capital injection over 5 years, split equally between the European Investment Bank and a consortium of Japanese tech firms. In exchange, Canada has legally locked in a 20-year binding commitment to prioritise deliveries of lithium, cobalt and weapons-grade titanium to European and Asian aerospace facilities. The strategic terms contain a specific clause that bars any raw materials extracted under this agreement from being resold or exported to nations that utilise unilateral executive authority to terminate international trade treaties. This clause effectively blocks American defense contractors from accessing Canadian critical minerals through secondary or European markets, forcing the Pentagon to source these minerals on the Chinese-dominated spot market at 3 times the pre-crisis cost. Third, the regulatory divergence and standardization accord. This is the silent killer for American industrial competitiveness. For 3 decades, Canadian manufacturing adhered strictly to American safety, labour, and environmental standards to ensure the seamless crossing of components along the integrated supply chain. This accord officially terminates that alignment. Canada has formally adopted the European Union's REACH standards for chemical compliance and the Euro 7 mobility framework for automotive engineering. The key players driving this change are European regulatory bodies and Canadian industrial associations who recognise that harmonising with Europe opens an immediate frictionless market of 450 million affluent consumers. The financial consequence of this structural pivot is immediate. It renders the entire cross-border supply chain between Ontario and Michigan illegal under Canadian law within 18 months unless American factories completely retool to meet European specifications. The accord strips American manufacturers of their geographic advantage, forcing them to choose between maintaining their domestic standards or spending an estimated $14 billion to re-engineer their production lines just to maintain access to Canadian inputs. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis as we continue to track how these massive legislative structures are being deployed. And make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button to support our independent coverage. What most analytical coverage completely overlooks is the financial mechanism that funds this continental realignment. Ottawa did not rely on taxpayer funding to launch this diversification strategy. Instead, they utilised the sudden collapse of the Canadian dollar on day 4 of the crisis to invite massive inflows of foreign direct investment from capital-starved sovereign wealth funds. By pegging the pricing of these long-term resource contracts to a basket of global currencies, specifically the euro and the yen, rather than the US dollar, Canada effectively insulated its resource sector from the inflationary shockwaves currently tearing through the American economy. This currency architecture means that while American manufacturing is experiencing a severe supply contraction, Canadian producers are being paid in highly stable non-dollar assets that are immediately reinvested into domestic infrastructure. The numbers tell the true story of this sovereign resilience. Within 72 hours of the executive order, international capital markets reallocated $28 billion of institutional investment out of American industrial ETFs and directly into Canadian resource-backed bonds. This is not an accidental market fluctuation. It is a structural flight to safety. The global financial community quickly recognized that Canada holds the physical assets, the actual energy, the actual minerals, the actual deep-water ports, while the United States holds an increasingly isolated consumer market heavily reliant on crumbling supply chains. The treaty architecture exploits this reality by ensuring that every dollar invested by Europe or Asia in Canadian infrastructure permanently reduces the volume of trade that can physically return to the United States. Even if a future administration attempts to reverse the original executive order, by tying Canada's sovereign resource wealth to the strategic survival of the European defence sector and the Japanese high-tech economy, Ottawa has built a multilateral shield that Washington cannot penetrate through economic bullying or political threats. The New Deal architecture does not merely reroute trade pipelines, it fundamentally alters who dictates the terms of continental commerce. The corporate boardrooms of Frankfurt, Tokyo and Seoul are no longer minor participants in North American economics. They are now the joint guarantors of Canadian sovereign trade. This comprehensive restructuring of the continental operating system reveals a harsh truth that Washington's policy planners completely failed to foresee. Power in the modern global economy does not belong to the nation that consumes the final product. It belongs to the nation that controls the primary inputs and the regulatory architecture that governs their assembly. By treating Canada as a subordinate supplier that could be disciplined through a 72-hour ultimatum, the White House inadvertently triggered the precise policy outcome American strategists have spent half a century trying to prevent. The permanent integration of Canadian resource wealth into European and Asian industrial ecosystems. The immediate fallout inside the United States is no longer confined to fluctuating stock prices or angry press releases from border state governors. It has materialized as a deep structural paralysis inside the factories, refineries, and military labs that form the foundation of American global dominance. But as these new international trade alliances solidify and the physical infrastructure begins shifting toward the coastlines, an even more dangerous vulnerability has begun to open up inside the most highly classified corridors of the American national security apparatus. The sudden dissolution of a 3-decade economic partnership has stripped Washington of its continental dominance, while Canada's rapid integration into Euro-Asian regulatory and resource alliances has permanently shattered the single buyer vulnerability of the Canadian economy. What began as a blunt exercise in unilateral American leverage has transformed into a masterclass in sovereign realignment, fundamentally rewriting the rules of engagement across the Western Hemisphere. Zooming out to the broader strategic horizon, the implications of this rupture extend far beyond disrupted assembly lines. They signal the formal end of the post-Cold War continental consensus and the birth of a fiercely competitive, multipolar trading environment. To fully grasp the magnitude of this transformation, one must contrast this newly emerged reality with the structural complacency of the pre-Trump era. For more than 30 years, Canada-US relations operated on an unspoken, comfortable assumption Ottawa would provide the raw physical inputs, the energy, the raw minerals, the integrated labour at deeply discounted, non-market rates in exchange for frictionless access to the massive American consumer market. This arrangement kept Canada prosperous but inherently captive, structurally dependent on a single neighbour that held an effective veto over Canadian economic independence. Today, that entire paradigm is dead. By forcing an overnight divorce, Washington did not isolate Canada. It inadvertently forced Ottawa to realise its own immense leverage as a primary resource superpower in a resource-scarce world. The geopolitical chessboard has now been fundamentally reordered across 3 critical arenas. In the realm of national défense, the strategic severing of the continental supply chain has exposed a profound vulnerability at the core of the American military-industrial complex. For decades, the Pentagon operated under the illusion that Canadian critical minerals were a permanent domestic security guarantee. By pushing Canada out of the integrated defence procurement framework, Washington has forced its own military contractors into direct competition with European and Asian buyers for essential inputs like lithium, cobalt, and titanium. Because Canada's new treaty architecture legally prioritises nations that respect international law, the United States is now structurally locked out of its own continental backyard. The strategic implication is clear. The production timelines for advanced American weapons platforms, from stealth fighters to naval vessels, are no longer determined in Washington, but are subject to regulatory clearance and resource availability dictated by newly formed alliances in Brussels and Tokyo in the energy sector. The destruction of the shared grid synchronization protocols has shattered the illusion of American energy independence. The northern tier of the United States has transformed from a region of stable, predictable energy security into a highly volatile spot market completely dependent on Canadian corporate decisions. While American refineries and utilities scramble to construct alternative infrastructure that will take a decade to materialize, Canada is already rerouting its immense hydropower and crude oil assets toward coastal maritime terminals funded by foreign capital. The long-term strategic balance has flipped. Ottawa is no longer a submissive supplier sending cheap energy southward, but a global energy broker selling to the highest international bidders in Europe and Asia, leaving American border states to face mounting structural deficits and soaring domestic utility costs. In the broader arena of international trade and global alliances, this crisis has accelerated the decline of unipolar American influence. Every major democracy from London to Seoul has watched the lightning-fast demolition of a foundational 31-year partnership and adjusted its strategic calculus accordingly. The The primary question dominating foreign ministries is no longer how to cultivate a bilateral relationship with Washington, but how quickly a nation can build alternative economic shields to insulate itself from sudden shifts in American executive authority. Canada's successful pivot to European and Asian regulatory standards provides a functional blueprint for middle powers worldwide, demonstrating that economic survival in the modern era requires deep diversification rather than blind reliance on a single, unpredictable superpower. So dive to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis as we continue to track the dismantling and rebuilding of these global power structures. And make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button to remain ahead of the strategic curve. The permanent casualty of this self-inflicted wound is the profound loss of American structural trust. Trust is an economic asset that takes generations to accumulate but can be entirely liquidated in 72 hours. And once it is gone, no subsequent administration can simply legislate it back into existence. Even if a future White House attempts to offer sweeping concessions or propose a total restoration of the historic framework, Canadian policy planners will never again allow the nation's economic survival to rest on the whims of a single foreign capital. The cage has not only been opened, it has been completely dismantled, and its components have been forged into an independent, global trade network. This shifts the entire nature of Canadian sovereignty from a defensive posture of managing American pressure to an offensive strategy of global resource diplomacy. Ottawa is no longer pleading for exceptions to protectionist Buy American policies. It is actively dictating the terms under which global industries can gain access to the raw materials required to power the 21st century economy. The financial and industrial centre of gravity on the continent has begun an irreversible slide away from the traditional manufacturing belts of the American Midwest and toward the highly diversified, internationally connected maritime corridors of Canada's coasts. We are now rapidly approaching the next critical juncture in this historic geopolitical realignment. As the 18-month grace period for regulatory divergence fast approaches, the ultimate decision point will not occur in a diplomatic boardroom, but on the factory floors of global manufacturing giants. Industrial conglomerates must soon decide whether to completely abandon their integrated American operations to maintain access to Canada's sovereign resource base, or remain bound to an increasingly isolated domestic US market. The choices made by these corporate boardrooms over the coming months will determine which nations retain industrial dominance for the next generation, proving definitively that when you unilaterally remove a partner from the table, you ultimately find yourself dining alone.